Good morning. Thank you for joining our plastic tax webinar this morning. I'm Fleur Lewis and I head up our food and drink sector here at Bishop Fleming. I'm here with my colleague Isabel Savage. She's our resident tax queen with a particular focus on manufacturing and also one of our R&D experts. Now, generally we love to talk tax, particularly Isabel. However, the plastic tax really is something else. It's new, it's complex. We've just had the draft legislation put out there, but actually waiting further guidance from HMRC. So we've actually brought in some experts at Ecosurety to tell us a little more about what they know, what it means for you, and the actions you can take to prepare for the introduction of the new tax in 2022. So here with us today, we have John Brooks, who's Head of Partnerships at Ecosurety, and Louisa Goodfellow, who's the Policy Advisor. There'll be an opportunity at the end to ask questions using our interactive Q&A, so please take the opportunity to ask them via the Q&A button on the screen. Helpful resources and documents will be shared after the event, and the webinar will be recorded, so you can always watch it after. So without further delay, I'll hand over to John. Passing over to you, John.
Great, thanks Fleur. Good morning everyone, thanks for joining. As Fleur said, I'm Head of Partnerships at Ecosurety. I'm here with Louisa, who will be presenting with me. My role is very much working with lots of our members, who I'll give you an idea about in a second, on lots of other complex regulation around producer responsibility, and the UK plastics tax is also now very pertinent. So we've been doing lots of work with various brands and retailers and manufacturers over the last few months. So we're just going to share some thoughts around the technical detail around the tax, and then also hopefully some useful insight into what those businesses who are affected can do to prepare and potentially mitigate the impacts of the tax. So I'll just give a very brief introduction to Ecosurety so that there's a bit of context as to why we're here, why we're working with Bishop Fleming on this. Louisa's going to give an overview in terms of what does the tax actually mean, what do we know so far, and I'll give some insight into some of the things that businesses can do to begin to prepare for the tax, and then a bit of an outlook into the future. So as a brief introduction, Ecosurety, we are a producer responsibility organisation. So we are a compliance scheme that operates in the packaging regulations and also across waste, electrical and batteries regulations, helping obligated businesses comply with those various regulations. And what that means is a lot of what we do is related to data and sales data for products, or in this instance packaging, and helping businesses to take those complex data sets, submit them to various agencies like the Environment Agency, and look at relevant costs associated with those various regulations. So there's lots of synergies with the requirements of the plastics tax, and we'll come on to that shortly, but it's worth just understanding the kind of synergies there. As a business, we're very much a purpose-led organisation. There's 42 of us, and we're based down in Bristol, and we are very much focused on how we can make a positive impact. So operationally, lots of what we do is number crunching and data interpretation, but there's a huge amount we do working in the recycling sector, looking at how we can support industry, how we can support the recycling infrastructure in the UK. So last year we also became a certified B Corp. Hopefully some of you will be familiar with B Corp. I think there's been probably quite a lot of companies looking at this in the last couple of years and becoming a bit more high profile. And that's really important as to who we are. You know, we're very passionate about how we can make a positive impact on the environment and community. So we fundamentally work to balance purpose and profit, and that's really important as to how we like to work with our clients to support their business needs, but also look at how you can turn some of these areas of regulation into an opportunity to do something good and make a positive difference. It is just a snapshot of some of the members we work with, so you can get an idea of the diversity of companies that we partner with and support across various regulations. And just to summarise, and the point around how we operate to make a positive impact is we really focus on our core purpose of change for good. And as I said, trying to look at these complex sets of legislation and how we can kind of make them less burdensome, but also look at how we can turn it into an opportunity to make a positive impact. So across producer responsibility, how we can look at using money that producers are paying into the system to invest in these kind of core areas, looking at increasing education of consumer, but also internally working with stakeholders to understand how they can improve packaging, decisions around packaging formats, for example, working with lots of recyclers to invest in creating new infrastructure. And we support various industry collaborations, which I'll touch upon a bit later on, as well as investing in new areas of innovation. And all of these things are very relevant to the plastics packaging tax and the requirements for recycled content, which again I'll touch upon a little bit later. So just before I hand over to Louisa, we thought it might be worthwhile to get a bit of an understanding of the audience's understanding of producer responsibility, because as I said, there are lots of synergies. So before we chuck loads of acronyms out there, we thought it might be worth just to get a bit of a sense for the audience today. So I'm just going to launch a Slido poll, which will hopefully work. And we'll just give this a minute. If you just go to slido.com on your phones or scan the QR code, you should be able to access this question and just vote for one of those answers. So if we just give it 30 seconds for people to complete that, that would be really useful. Okay, starting to have some come through now. That's a good start. There's some awareness, which is good. That's very useful. Okay, just give it another 10 seconds. Okay, great. That's really useful. So the positive thing here is that it doesn't look as though there's anyone who's totally clueless of what I'm talking about. So there's at least some awareness, which is good. So I'll still got some coming in. We'll share these results afterwards, but that's just good to get a bit of a pulse check on that. So I'll just pass over to Louisa now, who's going to give a bit of an overview of what we know so far with the plastics packaging tax. So Louisa, if you just like to tell me when you want me to skip on through your slides.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much, John and Fleur. Thanks, everyone. I'm Louisa. I'm a policy advisor at Ecosurety. And I could go on to the next slide now, please, John. I'm just going to go over just the basics of the tax and what we kind of definitely know, and some areas which we're still slightly unsure about. So for those of you that don't know, the tax is applied to plastic packaging that does not contain at least 30% recycled content. And we know that it's going to be charged at £200 a tonne. And it's going to begin at the start of the financial year in April 2022, so next year. This quote here is just lifted out of the consultation, and it describes the aim of the tax. Essentially, the aim is to incentivise producers of plastic packaging to use recycled content, and subsequently they would like it to boost the market for secondary material in the UK, so aiming to get a bit more of a closed loop plastic recycling system and build on the infrastructure that we already have. But the consultation also makes clear that they hope it will complement the packaging producer responsibility system that John just mentioned. If I could have the next slide, please. Thanks. So in terms of key exemptions and also inclusions, essentially all the kind of plastic packaging that you can think of is included, apart from packaging that is in direct contact with licensed human medicine, and the transit packaging that surrounds imported goods. And this is because neither the seller or the consumer has much particular say on what kind of packaging a transport company uses. So that might mean some shrink wrap, for instance, wrapped around a pallet of goods that's being imported into the UK. So even food grade packaging that is not technically allowed to have recycled content due to health and safety standards, it will still be liable for the tax. and also kind of longer term storage packaging items that you might not necessarily think of as packaging. For instance, Tupperware boxes will also be included. And this is not the same as the current packaging definitions under the producer responsibility regulations. So it is a slightly broader scope of materials included. And could I have the next slide, please, John? Sorry, excuse me. So liability for the tax, the first point basically just outlines where an item is defined as packaging. So if it's commissioned by or on behalf of a person for use as packaging, for instance, and then the 4 other bullet points there. The second and third points describe exactly where the tax point is. So the manufacturer of the packaging is the liable party, and they're liable after ancillary processing, which is basically the processing made to make it a piece of packaging, but before the pack filling stage in the domestic situation. But if the packaging comes from overseas, it will be the importer who first commercially exploits it who will have to pay the tax. So essentially the first importer of those items. It's also worth mentioning that, as is increasingly the case with tax regimes, or especially new tax regimes, that there's going to be a system of secondary liability and also a system of joint and several liability to deter non-compliance, or in the case of secondary liability, to recoup the funds in the event that the tax hasn't been paid by either the manufacturer or the importer. So if I could have the next slide, please, John. Thank you. Evidence requirements. Essentially, the business will need to calculate the proportion of recycled plastic based on a single production run. So basically, products that are made continuously on a single line, on a production line. And also HMRC do have the power to cross-check with other departments to ensure that this is the case. And if you could just click on, thank you. So you can see the basic calculation that's going to be used when calculating the taxable amount. And we're still waiting on confirmation from HMRC as to what evidence will actually be accepted to verify claims. So you can see on the right some suggestions that were outlined in the consultation. For instance, the tax could be proved via product specifications or quality assurance audits, but this is not definite just yet. There are also particular concerns, especially from industry, about verifying paper trails, I guess, from overseas. So we'll just have to wait and see what the final decisions are by HMRC in terms of evidence requirements. That said, we are part of an exciting project which will hopefully help in this area that I'm going to briefly go over a bit later. And so those are the basic points that we know so far about the tax, and I'm going to hand over to John. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Louisa. So yeah, I mean, there's some complexities as is clear, and there's also, unfortunately, some areas that we still are waiting for clarification on. But what I wanted to share is probably some things that certainly we're working on with lots of our members in terms of preparing for the tax, and some things that we can start to do even before we've kind of got the final confirmation of how exactly the tax will work, and in the areas of certification, as Louisa touched upon. And so just before I go into some of those practical things, again, it's worth just checking in on the sort of web of different areas of legislation that are coming into force or being looked at currently. And some of these won't be relevant to everybody, some of them will be relevant to other businesses. But what is clear is, certainly from a packaging perspective, that there are lots of different areas, such as reform of the packaging regulations and extended producer responsibility measures coming in, deposit return schemes, first in Scotland and then planned in Northern Ireland, England and Wales from 2023 onwards. And so there's lots of complexities that businesses are having to kind of grapple with, to understand what does it mean for my business, what's it going to cost me, what can I do to mitigate that, what am I going to have to do from a reporting requirement. And so we recognise that there's some significant challenges in there, and certainly requirements for data reporting are going to become more complex and more demanding. So there's lots of things that companies can start to do now to prepare for this. And so I thought I'd share this flow chart really in terms of how we look at those kind of steps to prepare for these various measures, obviously with a focus on the plastics packaging tax. But it really comes down to looking at these first kind of 4 areas here to get to the creation of a database, and this is really fundamental to be able to answer some of those questions that are raised in terms of what can we do to mitigate our costs, or what do our costs even potentially look like. And so what we see typically is that actually, because of fundamentally the requirements for the existing packaging regulations that are a bit more binary in terms of reporting different material types placed on the market, it doesn't necessarily mean that companies are in a position to have been accurately capturing different packaging formats and recycled content, which is obviously important for the plastic packaging tax. So what lots of the work we're carrying out at the moment, and certainly would recommend that companies look at, is actually what is the data that is being captured by your business at the moment? What's the process for capturing data from third-party suppliers potentially that you're dependent on? And what's the level of accuracy and confidence that you have in the accuracy of the data? So really, this year there's an urgency to make sure that you're in a position for next year to be able to accurately report both for the plastic packaging tax, but then also looking ahead to extended producer responsibility. And by doing that, you can start to enable all of these various different outputs. So, if you've got accurate data and you've got a good data set, there's lots of analysis that we can carry out, and this is very much our approach with our members, of looking at various different data insights that can enable that strategic decision making, enable future proofing of business in terms of what product lines are driving my costs, what can I do about it. And specific to the plastic tax, it's really about data preparation and capturing the data, as I said, and very much focusing on that this year. There's cost modelling that can be done, both at a sort of headline figure. This is what we need to start looking at from a budget perspective, but then really drilling into a SKU level analysis of what those key cost drivers are, to be able to start to make decisions and identify those potential opportunities to increase recycled content. And then from next year, as Louisa said, we don't have total clarity yet in terms of how this tax will actually work. What are going to be the requirements in terms of audit trail and certification. But what is clear, obviously, is to make sure that the quality of the data and the processes internally for businesses is efficient to be able to enable that reporting. And so we're looking at how we'll be able to support around that going into next year, with obvious synergies around the existing producer responsibility requirements of submitting on an annual basis sales data to report placed on market packaging figures. So lots to think about, but lots of actions that can be taken now to begin to mitigate that. And I thought I'd just share a couple of examples of how we've created various pieces of analytical platforms to help companies to identify those kind of opportunities. This isn't specific to the plastics tax, but it's very similar in terms of principle of inputting data, making sure that the coverage is there, and then being able to kind of break down various different insights to help companies make those strategic decisions and engage with supply chains. It's also worth highlighting that many of you might be aware of the UK Plastics Pact that's run jointly by Ellen MacArthur Foundation and WRAP, and Ecosurety are a signatory alongside I'm sure plenty of people on this call. And it's worth highlighting that if you are a member of the Plastic Pact, then you're probably going to have pretty good data already due to the requirements of that pact in terms of data reporting. But certainly what we've seen is that there's invariably opportunity to improve the accuracy and efficiency around that data. But this is just an example of what you can do with that data. to help to again support that strategic decision making, to take complex data sets and create visualizations that can be used with various stakeholders within the business, at a director level, for example, and stakeholders who aren't necessarily going to drill into lots of detailed spreadsheets, but need to understand what action can be taken. So there's some opportunities there that again link with producer responsibility, and I'm sure link with lots of the sustainability initiatives that many of the companies on this call will no doubt have, in terms of what are we doing about plastic, what are we doing as from an environmental stewardship perspective, and how can we engage with our customers or consumers better. So being able to get that insight is really fundamental to that. So a bit of a view in terms of where are we at the moment, and what does the future look like? And I guess some of the challenges, and I certainly don't want to present too much of a doom and gloom picture, but it's very important to understand some of the challenges that I'm sure some of you are facing, in terms of, even if we know what our product lines are that are driving our costs, what can we potentially do to mitigate those costs? And Louisa touched upon the challenge around food contact grade packaging, which is really challenging to be able to incorporate recycled content into at the moment. And lots of the challenges that we've seen is fundamentally the UK recycling infrastructure is not sufficient to tackle the plastic packaging which is placed on the market. And so we're in a situation where the majority of the plastic packaging which is collected has historically been exported, and you can see some of the statistics there. And without going into the kind of granularity of what's caused that, it's fundamentally based on the commerciality of the existing packaging regulations that has led to a favour of export. It's easier and more commercially attractive to export poor quality mixed plastic to various locations, and I'm sure lots of you would have seen some of the kind of high profile horror stories over the last couple of years. But what that means in relation to the plastics packaging tax is that there isn't enough recycled content being produced right now. So the tax implementation next year is really kind of out of alignment with what is required from extended producer responsibility and other measures to ensure that there is proper investment in UK recycling infrastructure, both from a collection perspective and also from a recycling infrastructure perspective in terms of capabilities and technology. So the positive thing there, however, is there are lots of enormous opportunities to increase the amount of material which is being recycled onshore, and there's lots of work going on at the moment to build additional infrastructure and to look at some of the low-hanging fruit, I guess, which certainly you could apply that phrase to film and flexible plastic, where you can see there a very low number of local authorities currently collect that kind of material. There's an enormous amount of that material which is placed onto the market which is currently not recycled. So being able to tap into that volume of material is going to be really fundamental to increase the amount of recycled content that in time will be accessible and being able to incorporate into various packaging formats, with the longer term goal, of course, of being able to apply it to food grade applications. The limitations around technology for food grade applications at the moment is because where we're dependent on mechanical recycling, it's more difficult to kind of reach the quality that's required. However, there's lots of work being undertaken at the moment to get to that point, and there's various opportunities around chemical recycling, which I'm sure again lots of people on this call have heard about. It isn't quite there yet, but there's exciting developments happening at the moment. So in terms of some of the potential solutions around this, I touched upon the opportunity around increasing the collection and recycling of film and action that industry can be taken. And I'm sure again that some people on this call are aware of various things that are going on. Ecosurety and some of our partners will be making an announcement in a matter of weeks about a significant initiative that we're leading, which will be complementing the work that the Plastics Pact has done. And I'm sure some of you will have started to see at your local supermarkets front of store collections for film and flexible plastic. There's lots of conversation as well around how eventually we can get to a situation where this material is collected at curbside, and it certainly feels like the direction of travel is positive and that there's widespread support to get to that point. And again, that's going to be, you know, absolutely critical in terms of enabling producers in the UK and those affected by the plastics packaging tax to actually be able to reach those levels of 30% recycled content incorporated. The second point is really to engage in the resources and waste consultations that are out at the moment, which again, not specific to the plastics packaging tax, but the EPR consultations and the DRS consultations offer a kind of once in a generation opportunity to shape how we deal with resources and waste in this country, and it will be critical to how infrastructure develops. It will be critical to how material is collected, which is all going to be absolutely vital for everybody in relation to both the plastics packaging tax, but also extended producer responsibility, and those economic drivers for investment and the innovation in infrastructure are absolutely critical. The final point before I pass back to Louisa is really the advanced data insights that I touched upon really can help to enable those strategic decisions around potential material substitutions, looking at where recycled content can be increased. So that's really probably the key call to action, is to make sure that work that can be done now to improve data quality and beginning to carry out some analysis on that should be a priority. It's important, however, when looking at potential material substitutions, to not make knee-jerk reactions, and life cycle assessments can be important there. So hopefully not too doom and gloom, certainly some encouraging things happening in the industry, but hopefully that gives a bit of an insight as to why some of the challenges that I'm sure some of you experiencing at the moment are occurring. So I'll just pass over to Izzy, I think actually prior to handing over to Louisa from Bishop Fleming, who I think wanted to come in on this point.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. I'm just going to take one of your phrases, John, that you used at the beginning, and you were talking about turning a tax into an opportunity. And I like that, and I'm going to have that for myself. Thank you very much. So really, I suppose what you've been talking about there is the sort of innovation that we're expecting people that are impacted by the new tax to be undertaking. And it might be that you're impacted by the new tax because you actually have the hands-on administrative burden because you're the producer or you're the importer, or actually you might have the financial burden of being somewhere further down the line where either you've got the joint and several liability, or actually those additional costs have been passed on to you. And I suppose for all of us, that's what I'm saying, is for all of us anywhere in that supply chain, the whole idea of this tax is it's supposed to be incentivizing us to make some changes. And I just wanted to remind you, with my accountant's hat on, because I can't resist, that there is, of course, a tax relief for any of us that are innovating. And we mustn't forget R&D. I know as accountants, we're always banging on about it. But if you're thinking about weighing up the costs of undertaking some big projects, some big innovation, don't forget to think about the sort of tax benefits of making an R&D claim. So if you're undertaking the appropriate activities, you can, of course, fund up to 25% additionally under the SME scheme through your tax relief claim. So for every £100 spent, you get an extra £25 potentially of tax relief. Or if you're loss making in a year, which you might be if you're investing an awful lot of money, you could potentially get up to 33% back in cash for every £100 that you've spent on your qualifying activity. So just think in the back of your mind, when you're weighing up how you're going to be spending, just think there is some tax relief to be had on the one hand, whilst the Chancellor's taking the tax away on the other. Okay, thanks very much. If I can pass back to Louisa.
Great, thanks, Isabel. So I'm just going to briefly go over this project that I mentioned earlier, and it's essentially going to be kind of a first of its kind method to verify recycled content claims. It's a partnership of a number of organisations. So we've got the British Standards Institute, who are hoping to build what they term a flex standard around the plastic packaging tax. But before that, this project Record is essentially run by Impact Solutions and the Scottish Plastic Recycling Centre of Excellence, and they are developing chemical methods in which to verify a % claim of recycled content within plastic packaging. So hopefully this will be a way for both producers of plastic packaging to get their material tested and be another stream of evidence for HMRC to say, yes, I have over 30% or whatever %, but also perhaps a way for HMRC again to check recycled content claims as and when necessary. So it's being funded by the Small Business Research Initiative, and they are hoping to be kind of well underway ahead of the tax in April 2022. So it's a great initiative, and if you have any questions, please do get in touch with me. And I'm going to just go on to the next slide, please, John. Next steps wise, the kind of formal consultation period has come to an end now for the tax. So we're kind of waiting on a detailed guidance document from HMRC, and then hopefully this will outline some examples of where tax points are. It will provide clarity about how you can evidence your tax, your recycled content, for instance. And also the draft legislation is currently being passed at the moment, so that will be in place ahead of April 2022. I think that's it for us. So we're going to go on to questions and answers now. So I'll hand back over to Fleur.
Thanks, Louisa. Thanks, John and Isabel. As you can probably imagine, we are getting a lot of questions in. We will try and get to answer all your questions, but if we don't get to answer them, then obviously you can contact us directly, and we'll make sure we come back to you. So just picking off some of these questions. So someone asks about packaging containing multiple plastics and asking whether the 30% applies to the combined weight of the packaging or individually for each component. Perhaps John or Louisa, could you help us with that one?
I can pick that one up if you like. So the tax is going to be applied to the combined weight of the packaging, but only if that packaging is predominantly plastic by weight. So if it's 60% plastic and the rest is paper, for instance, the whole of that piece of packaging will be weighed and you will be charged on that entire piece of packaging. So it's not on the component level, and it will be charged. The whole piece of packaging will be charged, and the calculation, as I mentioned earlier, is based on a production run or units that are manufactured continuously in a single production line.
Thank you. And I think probably one for you, Louisa, as well, but just asking whether we can elaborate a bit more on the exemption on the transport packaging around imports.
Sure. So I imagine it's not the term that they use within the consultation, but it's what kind of a lot of people in the industry might term as tertiary packaging. So if there is a company from overseas and they've shipping a crate of goods, for instance, and the freight company that they've hired to send it to the UK puts a bit of shrink wrap around it, that particular transit packaging that they're terming will be exempt. And as maybe I didn't make more clear, it's because it's neither the importer's decision or the consumer's decision about what kind of packaging they feel they want to use when transporting those goods.
Okay, thank you. And someone's just asking about whether this would replace the plastic PRNs that are required for the compliance with the Packaging Waste Directive.
No, I can come. It looks like Louisa was poised to say something as well, but I can answer that, and then Louisa, if you want to add something to it. Unfortunately, no, it won't replace that. So there's going to be the plastic packaging tax that will run alongside the existing packaging regulations. So PRNs, packaging recovery notes, will still be required. And to kind of allude to my earlier slide showing all the regulation that's coming in, that's then going to overlap with the implementation of extended producer responsibility, where PRNs will be replaced by something else and fees will be modulated. So it'll be, rather than paying a price for a plastic PRN, fees will be modulated based on the recyclability and other variables in terms of the makeup of that plastic. So, you know, a more complex packaging format with multi-material will be attract a higher fee than, say, for example, a PET bottle, which is easy to recycle, which will have a lower fee. That's yet to be determined, so there's lots of work to be done on that. But in short, no, the plastic tax will run alongside that, I'm afraid to say. So it kind of adds to the complexity and, unfortunately, to the cost.
Thanks, John. A question here just on secondary packaging. So, for example, polystyrene used to protect a product. Would this fall in the scope of the tax?
Louisa, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm actually not entirely sure. I would say yes, because it is plastic and it is packaging, but I think that's one that I should go and double check, and I can get back to the question asker on that one. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Okay, thank you. And just a question here just on that makeup of the plastic. So, or the packaging. If the pack is majority paper with 5% plastic, is the plastic still needing to have PCR?
So if it's predominantly a piece of paper packaging, but with a 5% plastic in it, no. Again, it's only counted within the tax framework as plastic packaging if it's predominantly plastic by weight. So if it's predominantly paper by weight, you won't have to pay tax on that particular piece of packaging.
Brilliant, thank you. Question here about one of our listeners. They're a retailer and just asking whether suppliers will be required to inform them of the plastic packaging content of items delivered to them.
I don't know. I mean, Louisa, maybe if you want to come in first and I can perhaps add to it.
Yeah, sure. My understanding is that the only mandatory notification you have to give of the tax is on the invoice. So the manufacturer will have to make it quite clear on the invoice to the people that they sell their packaging onto. They'll have to have a separate thing on the invoice that says tax, and this is how much I paid, and that's the visibility of the tax measure. But as I don't think there's any requirements for a retailer to state the recycled content or the tax paid. I'm not sure if you have anything to add, John.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, it kind of comes back to the sort of overlapping regulations. So with extended producer responsibility, again, it's to be determined, but there's going to be a changing point of compliance that will in part affect a retailer for own brand packaging, but there's going to be a sort of intertwining web of costs, and the reporting requirements in general are likely to affect retailers. So whilst it might not specifically be in relation to the plastics tax or what the costs associated to that are, it's likely that there's going to be increased visibility in terms of providing that information through the supply chain in terms of what's the makeup of my packaging, what's the format of it, what's the recycled content levels. It's not concrete yet because the consultations are taking place currently, but that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Okay, I'm getting some quite specific questions here. So one here talking again about that transit packaging. It's talking about where it's technically the primary packaging. So for example, a set of garden furniture that comes in a cardboard outer box with bubble wrap inside. Would this bubble wrap be in scope or still considered transit?
I think the bubble wrap will still be in scope. So transit is literally just the, as I said, the shrink wrap or perhaps a pallet used by the freighter to get the item from A to B. But kind of what you term maybe secondary packaging, like bubble wrap and things like that, that's still, yeah, that's very much in scope.
Great, thank you. A question here about specialist plastic. So, for example, fluoroplastic. If it's supplied to another business and the ultimate use is not known, is this caught by the legislation?
Not sure. Do you have any thoughts on this one, John? Or
I'm not sure in terms of the specific plastic type, but yeah, I'm not sure. We might need to have a look at that and come back to them. Sorry if we don't necessarily have all the answers today, but we can certainly take it away and do some research on that.
Thank you.
Certainly no. Oh, sorry. I was just going to add. There's certainly no specific exemption for packaging that you don't know the ultimate use for, or like specialist plastics like fluoroplastic. So I would assume so. But again, yeah, I could do get back to you on that one.
Okay, thank you. I think that was a question from David. So feel free to send in more details, and we can come back to you on that. So I feel like I'm bombarding Ecosurety with questions. I think that covers quite a lot of the questions that we've asked. Some are quite specific. I guess just one last one, just conscious of time. Is there a requirement to put the recycled content information on the packaging itself?
No, as I said, the only requirement at the moment is the invoice. Is the invoice that the manufacturer will give the business that buys their packaging from them. That's the only requirement that's in the legislation at the moment. But I suppose it would be in some producers' interest to put it on their plastic packaging from the consumer point of view. You know, there would probably be consumer interest in knowing the recycled content of a bottle, for instance.
I was going to say, just to add to that, yeah, probably from the consumer perspective, and this is kind of to the project we're involved in. You're looking at the kind of certification of claims of recycled content. You know, will be key in that to make sure that, you know, valid claims are there. And then I guess the only other thing, again, in terms of the EPR consultations, currently there is a section on mandatory labelling, but as I understand it, it's not specific to say about levels of recycled content. It's more, you know, the kind of OPRL side of things in terms of can you recycle it or not, without going into the granularity of what levels of recycled content there are.
Good question here about how do they demonstrate that the plastic is 30% recycled?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, is how do you certify all this? So, you know, again, we're kind of waiting for clarification on what the process will be, but it's going to be a combination of, I guess, the paper trail and the auditing, and you know that's not a million miles away from existing packaging regulations. You know, making sure that weights that are reported are correct and auditing the paper trail of that. So that's one key way. The other side will be, hopefully through the work that we're doing with our partners, including the British Standards Institute, will be creating a standard and a methodology and way to actually assess the makeup of the packaging, you know, from more of a kind of scientific standpoint, I suppose, of actually, you know, does it actually have recycled content in it? So, you know, yet to be determined, but I think they're probably the two key ways of auditing that.
And a few questions here, just thinking about, obviously this is a UK tax at the moment, but do we expect other regimes, or I guess the EU, for example, to bring in some kind of plastic tax like this?
Yeah, I mean, Louise, I don't know if you want to come in, but there are other examples, and I think the EU have implemented a plastics tax. Need to check on the detail on that. I don't know, Louisa, if you've got any insight on that.
Yeah, sure. So there is, I think some countries have started, there is an EU directive, and the funds raised are going to go towards the EU Coronavirus Recovery Fund. But in that, it's a bit different to the UK example, because it's levied on that particular member state's government as opposed to the individual producers of plastic packaging within that country. So it'll be up to a member state's government as to whether they want to in turn charge their producers for the tax. But as it stands, it's being implemented that every EU member state will have a plastic packaging tax too on unrecycled plastic content within the packaging. But it's a bit different to the UK one.
Isabel, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I was just going to say I'd read similar that, but it's not on recycled content in the plastics. It's if the plastics were not recyclable, and there are issues with various plastics that it's still very tricky to recycle certain types. But that's what work's being undertaken and has been for years. One of the points I just wanted to mention is I was quite disappointed to see that compostables weren't excluded from this tax, and you sort of think, well, clearly people that have done the work on the compostables are, you know, they're going the right way, but I do get it that the whole idea is we're trying to increase the market for recycled plastics. Hence, currently, rather sadly, compostables are still included.
Thank you. I think it's probably a good place to wrap it up. Appreciate there's questions there that we haven't answered, but perhaps you'd just like to send in any specific questions to us, and we're happy to pass them on to Ecosurety or help you ourselves. So just to say to everyone, thank you so much for coming today. I hope that has been really interesting. It is a complex area. And I think there's obviously a lot more guidance to come out. So yeah, watch this space. We'll have more details on our website. So in particular in our food and drink and manufacturing knowledge hubs. So please go to our main site at Bishop Fleming. Obviously Ecosurety also have a lot of information on their websites. That's all from us. Thank you very much for attending. Wishing you a very happy bank holiday, and let's hope that we get some sunshine. Thank you.